Okay, so moving on to the next session for discussion, let's talk about how you create a piece of music, and just take music as the example for the moment. As the sound painter, what goes through your head? What are you thinking about when you start to create a new piece?
Well, I think an important thing for me is, as a live composer, is to clear my mind before I step in front of the group, for the concert. And I usually, for clearing my mind, I'll watch a science fiction film, for example, or go take a walk. Do anything that I can to remove myself from the knowledge that I'm going to be live composing that evening. The last thing I'll do is listen to somebody else, like if I'm in a festival or something. I will rarely go listen to some other group before me because I'm afraid of kind of getting handcuffed by that. In some cases that might be interesting to do.
So there's a fear of almost creating and copying or relating to what you've heard, or citing it and trying to bring it back in the voice.
Yeah, the energy of that piece, the energy of that piece, if I listen to it, it will find its way into my work. I've had it happen, so I've chosen not to prepare for a piece that way. I prepare by clearing my mind, by doing something, different with my brain, watching a science fiction film.
So we come back to what you said in the definition for sound painting, that because you create in the moment, you want to be surprised and in some respects shocked by what the group give you. You throw out a proposition, you're a whole group long tone go, you don't know which tone it's going to be, you don't know how loud in that sense, and then you can work with that because you've not got the sort of shackles that's holding us to do something. Right. Okay, so if we're thinking about starting a piece, most live composers, myself included, thinks you stand there, whole group, what are you going to do, where do you start? Can we sort of go through ways in which you might start a composition?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it's one of those, situations. Every time when I stand up in front, it's like, okay, what is going to be the first way to initiate content or response that I'm going to compose with, So I have my favorite ways of beginning, but after I call them my favorite ways and realize they're my favorite ways, they're not my favorite ways anymore, because then it becomes something I'm kind of shackled to, handcuffed to, that I often will start a piece with point to point, or start a piece with scanning, a search gesture.
So I love to start with hits.
Or hits,
yeah, long tone, change the dynamics off, yeah.
Right, I pose this question to other sound painters just to see what they do, so I can steal their ideas, and that's true. So I mean, I normally, if you were to nail me down, what is the gesture you use the most to start a composition? I would say it's point to point. Yeah.
Okay, so we're thinking about, as we said in the last section of the syntax, that it is possible to edit and to structure the piece. We can bring back an idea back with a memory, or go on to, come back to. But in structuring the piece, we obviously have this direction. We've got to get to the end point. We've no idea how long the piece is going to be. But in getting to that end point, what types of ways do you end a piece, or actually close it?
And actually, it's because I've been doing this for so long, and I know other sound painters too. They've been sound painting for 10 years or more, and sound painters have this inherent ability to understand a block of time. So if somebody says to me, "Oh, you need, your space tonight in a festival," or "We need you to just do, one composition tonight," and say I want to do an hour-long composition, I can do an hour-long composition. I can, after 55 minutes, I know it's time to start to look for the ending. And so what do I do as far as what goes from the moment I start to the moment I'm ending? What am I working with? Well, I'm working with two basic things. I'm working with, as far as structure goes, I'm working with block composition, to where we go from one idea to the next in a very quick manner, sometimes without relationship to the block from before, but of course there is a relationship because it's all a part of the same piece, so for that reason there is a relationship. or I'm making a linear, relationship by using gestures that will allow me to make reference to what came before or what's going to come next. So it's a more of a linear approach to the composition. And most of the time I use both in some form or another. When it comes time to end the composition, this is where many sound painters who first begin with the language have a lot of trouble, because what is the ending? Sometimes the form of the composition can be more collage-like, and the ending seems like, like, why have an ending? I mean, why not just keep sound painting, all week long? In fact, there is an ending that presents itself. And when you start to go looking for that ending, it will present itself. And an experienced sound painter, he or she will be able to see it. So at 55 minutes, I'm going to start looking at where the ending is, and when it presents itself, I grab it and make an ending with it.
So I'm going to tackle you on that. How does an ending present itself? What exact things are you listening for or trying to work with? Is it something that's a contrast? Is it something that's a repeat that seems to be more emphasised? I mean, for example, I quite often with a piece you can get a crescendo, speedy tempo. I mean, I'm thinking of something like Ravel's Bolero or Ravel's La Valse. It builds, it builds, it builds, it ends. Or I'll use hits with more gaps in between until I get a lower, quieter hit, so you bring it down, and I'll think of an arch shape. But for you, what presents itself?
Well, we all take the same trip. The sound painter and the performers are taking the same trip together. And usually I tell the performers, but not always, I'm going to do an hour-long piece, or I'm going to do a series of shorter pieces. But let's stick with the hour-long piece, because that's the one that's, more complicated as far as dealing with the time and ending and starting and structure and all that. We're taking the trip together, and how does the ending present itself? Where we've all been on the same excursion, and as I've been sound painting a long time, so I can kind of like give a push that will make an ending happen. Mm-hmm. There's something I'm looking for, I'm repeating a memory, I'm doing something rhythmically, dynamically, something with the lights, just speaking about music, sorry. I go to kind of help generate the ending. But the ending will also present itself without my doing that, and I'd like to cite, speak about Pauline Oliveras, where I did a wonderful composer, Pauline, and I went to hear her speak, and a friend of mine, and to take her class, and at one point we all laid on the floor, speaking about ending, we all laid on the floor, and we were fairly close to each other, mm-hmm. and it was a class of about 40, and people just started making sounds and doing things, and a lot of it, is free improvisation in that sense. People are making all kinds of sounds, and some people are relating to them, and some people are initiating new paths to go. And there was no ending decided, but even in this collective improvisation, the ending presented itself, and it was as if we had spoken about it, and decided, after such and such a time, there would be the ending. The ending just presented itself, and it was obvious to all of us.
So we're really coming back to the fact that the performer in a live composition has to be active. They've got to listen, they've got to remember what's happened, what's coming forwards, but they've got to be peripherally sort of aware of what's going on around them, listening and almost sensing what the next person's going to do.
Yeah, sometimes.
Make that together.
So, yes. I mean, yes and no. I mean, we're all living in the same kind of, performance world at that point. Mm-hmm. And sometimes the performers are working more with blinders, as we say, without any knowledge of the others, and experienced sound painting performers can really close people off.
And it's worth saying that if you're performing in blinders, you're not going to give a contrast, which is what's often
yeah, if you're performing with blinders, you're not making any relationship to anybody. If speaking about that for a second, if somebody is, if I'm with blinders and if somebody next to me plays softly, pianissimo, and I play loud, then I've made a relationship dynamically, and so I absolutely have nothing to do with whatever they do, and that's playing with blinders. But so however we go through this excursion together, I mean, I have a number of ways. Either sometimes the ending will present itself, and often endings do that. Or sometimes I will structure something, put some phrases and things in there that I know that are going to generate an ending for me.
I've seen you generate an ending by inserting the audience. So you've scanned around the group, you've turned around to look at the audience, and you've scanned all the way around to the audience. And then you've used minimalism, you've got it louder, you've changed the tempo, and then you've done that with the audience and got it louder and louder and louder and faster and faster and faster, and cut it everybody off once they're involved.
Yeah, yes. I mean, sometimes it's something I just like to do. It's not to educate the public at all, the audience with sound painting. That is by no means my goal or reason. My reason is because I'm extremely selfish. With the fact that I have an audience there that can make sound and movement, and I'm going to use them. I don't care that you're there as an audience. I'm more interested in that I'm a composer up here, and I have 300 people sitting behind me watching me, and I might want to use them also.
So they're a found instrument. Yes.
They're a found instrument. There they are. And so sometimes I'll end the piece by incorporating the audience, and sometimes not. You know, it just depends on. It depends on what the performance was, you know, kind of what am I doing? If I'm doing a performance that's incorporating, you know, amateurs and professionals and people of all ages, sometimes I enjoy, or the audience seems really energetic. Sometimes I enjoy bringing them in. They don't know I'm going to do it, and it's not didactic. I don't stand up there and explain anything. I just do it, and it often works wonderfully. Yeah.
So thinking of this idea in relation to music for now, of what you do while you're signing, we've spoken about the fact you can bring other styles of music or other ideas into the composition, but not necessarily having to cite them, not being restricted by it. So could I ask you to explain this idea of feels? So you could ask for minimalism with a swing feel, for example. How do you use feels, and what types of feels do we have available in sound painting?
Yeah, I mean, there's a feel is a jazz term. You know, play that with a 3 feel, play that with a swing feel, play that with a samba feel. You know, it's, in other words, play that with the style of this thing. So feel is style. And in sound painting, we have 2 ways of dealing with feel. If we say, you know, minimalism with a swing feel, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to play jazz. They're not going to play jazz. They're going to have, there's something about it, there's a certain kind of undercurrent that gives a swing quality to what's going on.
It could be a rhythmic quality or a pitch contour quality.
Yes, it doesn't mean like literally play jazz. It means to incorporate something about that feeling with whatever the content is, you know. If I want really to have jazz or classical or any, you know, area of classical, whether it's, you know, Baroque or whatever, or classical, then, for example, it would be minimalism with a swing feel, and this is called closed or only. And what I've done is I've closed down the parameters to do anything else but playing swing or playing jazz. And also, when we say swing feel, just to add this. Suppose we want Dixieland or swing or bebop or post-bop or hard bop or free jazz, and if we want that, then we would say, or classical going from Baroque, etc., 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 or rock going from early rock, etc., etc., etc. Say we want, you know, say we want bebop, and we're going to go through all of those other, you know, areas of swing, so to speak, of jazz. So we might be using Dixieland and swing and bebop and hard bop that evening in the composition, and we want to identify bebop. It would just simply be, we would call it swing 3.
So you can default the style of something. So if you want bebop, it's swing. It could be default 1. You
can, yeah, it could be default
2.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So you think about the parameters of the style you might want to bring in beforehand.
Yes, and then, you know, and of course, different sound painters might want, because they use one particular style a lot, they might come up with their own gesture for that, you know, and like Jennifer Rayfeld with, you know, Swedish folk music. I mean, it's her group, the Swedish Soundpainting Orchestra, that does that. Not many other orchestras do it. And I know some people that have a specific style for a certain 2-beat music in Catalonia, and they have a special gesture for that.
It's fascinating because it's showing how sound painting can integrate the cultural context. It is universal, but it doesn't have to be. You can integrate the music of the place.
Yeah, the basic language is the basic 1,500 signs are universal, but of course if you have something specific you want to add, I mean, we do that with spoken language all the time.
It's worth saying the basic 1,500, if you just said, aren't all basic, but there's a basic sort of 45 that gives you almost 300-400 combinations. So actually you only need a handful of gestures to create a piece. You don't necessarily need sort of more than 1,000 to work with it anymore.
No. That's a good point. Is that, you know, although there's over 1,000 gestures in the language, in an evening, getting back to composing, in an evening I might use only 20, 25 to 65 signs in the composition. I don't use 300 or 400 signs in the composition. No.
I think we'll come back to later in another section just about the number of signs and the ways in which you think about whether you're going to chance this or whether you're going to theorise over it as well. But let's take an idea you've just had. We've spoken about integrating different styles of music, but you can actually integrate a pre-composed piece or section or a citation by using palettes. And you mentioned palettes in section 1 when you spoke about the background to sound painting, that you had composed something to improvise from. So you're really, you've not moved away from the basic philosophy you started with, I would assert, in using palettes. So can you demonstrate what that is?
Yeah, palette, the sign is this, and a palette is any piece of, you know, or pre-planned, pre-composed, a set of rules, the music, text, choreography, visual design. It's anything that's sort of pre-planned, whether it's a piece of music that I've notated, a handful of words I've, you know, written down for actors, some specific choreography I've set on the dancers, some specific installation I want to happen with the visual artist, some specific thing I want to happen with the lighting designer, etc., etc. And so that I would be able to call, if I wanted something I choreographed for the dancers, as I could say dancer palette 1, for example, slowly enter, or music palette 1. So that's what a palette is. And
so what's the breadth of the palette? For example, could I give you sort of a 10-note row, or could I give you the first movement of Beethoven's Fourth Symphony?
Both. I mean, a palette is both. It could be suppose I wanted to have, for example, I didn't know how to sign, I'm a beginner sound painter and I don't know how to sign, not too beginner, but I don't know how to sign, you know, pointillism with just the C major scale. Because I don't know how to sign C major scale, which the signs exist, but say I don't know them. Then I would just say whole group pointillism with palette 1, and in palette 1 would be use the C major scale. Or in another instance, maybe palette 1 is, you know, the first few measures of Beethoven's Fifth, or maybe palette 1 is, you know, it could be something very strict, or it could be a set of rules, you know.
So to draw an analogy that might help illustrate this, because I know you're interested in cooking, the palette is some form of using the content, but how you use it varies. So I can throw flour in a sauce, can throw flour in a cake and in a pie. It's still flour, but how I'm using it's different. And the reason I say that is you could say you want palette 1 when you're scanning, when you're using point to point, so scanning with palette 1, or you could be, you know, point to point with palette 1, which means
or
you've
improvise with palette 1, or etc.
So you're really sectionalising it, aren't you? I'm thinking also that you use this gesture as well. So could you? Yeah,
palette punch. Palette punch is a brief interruption, if you will, you know, and it could be. So if you assign a palette punch, it's a tiny bit of material. It could be just. Let's imagine, you know.
Well, an example you used when you first came over to London was you asked for 2 words and we ended up with dog sandwich. And previously we've sort of asked for a verb and an adjective to come up with just something really short. Yeah.
Yeah, so some years back, 5 years or something like that, dog sandwich was the palette. You know, palette punch, I'm sorry, was the palette punch. And by rule, the palette punch comes in, the sound painter signs it, and then afterwards the performers immediately return to the material before. So if you're signing whole group long tone, you know, ooh, dog sandwich, ooh, you know, you go back to what was going on before. Now the palette punch can be something comical, or it can be something, you know, that's not comical or menacing. It could be a small little piece. or some little quick movement.
It could be a series of chords as well as picture rhythm material.
It could be the whole group, it might be a movement palette punch where you call palette punch and then everybody waves and then goes back to playing, Palette punches, palettes, all of them, the sound painter has to rehearse them just like rehearsing anything that's been sort of preset. If you really want to get the palette punch to be really a strong piece of material, then you rehearse that little morsel until you have it exactly like, what was it, bad sandwich? So how you say bad sandwich is very important, and that's what the sound painter will do. Is it bad sandwich in a very pedestrian, sort of nonchalant sort of way?
So for example, single one, palette punch one, go. You could say dog sandwich, but then you can change the volume, change the tempo of it, you stick it, freeze parts of it and really work with that so it becomes something else entirely. So do you want to sign yourself a palette punch and show us what you might, so if you sort of sign the changes but also iterate what happens to it.
I mean, what I might do with a palette punch.
Yeah.
So if dog sandwich was our palette punch, right?
Well, we could change something else. Well, we're in an art studio, so why don't we have paint and green? Green paint.
Green paint?
Yeah.
Okay, so say green paint is our palette punch, and how you say that is important. So we would, of course, rehearse how we say green paint. Maybe
really excitable green paint.
Green paint? So it could be like, oh my gosh, green paint. So everybody would say green paint that way. In its palette punch one, in its first form, it would be, everybody would go, green paint, with this, exclaiming how wonderful it is that we have green paint. How you might use that is you could say whole group, palette punch one, and then change the tempo. So then you do this, it'd be like, green, paint, paint, paint. And so then you could, a palette punch is often done very quickly. You could slow it down and grab a piece of it with stab freeze, or you could freeze it, or you could, so that's one example, or you could take it point to point with palette punch one, green, 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 and unless I stayed on for a while I wouldn't get green paint. So there's all kinds of ways of working with it, green, green, this.
It gives you a really good idea of how you can take something that's pre-composed or preset and to develop with it, because obviously if you've got a palette which is much longer, you can play the entire thing from beginning to end, or you can use it in sections. I think the important thing for the live composers amongst us is, as we've spoken about before, how do you get to a palette and out of the palette if you are free composing around something?
Right, especially when the palette punch is another thing. So just speaking more about the palette, how do you get to a palette? Do you just sort of introduce it without sort of, foreshadowing it a bit? Yes, of course, you can. If you want to have that kind of, there it is, and it surprises you, sure. Depends on what it is and what you're doing in the composition, and if foreshadowing is not important for you when you finally perform the palette, that's your choice. There's also, that's one way to do it, and another way is to lead into it by saying scanning with palette one, or point to point with palette one, or improvise with palette one only, or leave it more open, or shape line with palette one, or launch mode with palette one, So there's many different ways to kind of sort of foreshadow and lead into the palette, so then when it finally is performed in its entirety, or not, but when it's performed in its more strict form, as it's been notated, so to speak, then there's it's a very strong moment in the piece.
So in a sense, you're setting yourself a challenge by, you've got this pre-composed piece, whether it's notated or what have you, of how to get to that fully formed version, and you're pulling it apart and you're being experimental with it before you get to it, and then you've got to work your way out. So it's very much that teleological journey. You're moving from A to B with a particular set of, I am going to move through that at some point.
Right, exactly. You move from A to B, go from A1 to A2 to A3 to A4, A5, and finally to A, to B. Again, you don't have to do that. That's just one way. If you want to sort of foreshadow and lead into a palette, then you do that. But of course, there's times where the live composer, the sound painter, they just want to like pop in that palette as a surprise. So it's both are of course available.
I think what we're talking about here in terms of music at the moment is just how detailed the sound painting language can be. So you can ask for the chance material through scanning and see what comes out, but actually you can modify these types of signs. So taking scanning as the example, there's not just one way to use that particular content. So could you illustrate other ways and sort of how many ways there are to use the scanning as a gesture?
Oh, scan, you mean to include maybe some of the other scans?
Yeah.
The other type. Yeah, first of all, it's maybe interesting to know for some people, some sound painters who don't know where I came up with scanning. And scanning was, I was sitting in my apartment on 786 Amsterdam Avenue many years ago in New York City, watching a football, watching a soccer game. And I watched the public. You know, this is like 1985 or something.
Waves.
Yeah, the public stands up and they make the wave, you know, the public makes. And I thought, right then I thought, you know, wow, you know, that was the first time I had seen that. I thought, okay, what if I did that with sound, with my orchestra? How could I get that same thing to happen? And so that's where the idea came up, so that I created that, you know, when my arm lines up with you, you perform something. And I later created the rate of development and all that to go along with it. And as my arm passes by, you stop. You don't play until my arm lines up with you, and then you stop. You play it in, and then you stop. You know, so it can be very short, little things that you're doing, just very short, you know, bits of material that you're giving the sound painter.
But of course, there are about 25 different types of scans, aren't there?
There are 25 different types of scanning, and this is the reason that many times I tell, you know, sound painters who've just come into the language that you must use layer scanning if you have material being performed and the whole group is playing a long tone and you want to use scanning. You wouldn't just scan over like this because it doesn't tell them what to do with the long tone. It's confusing. Well, what do I do with the long tone? Do I go to the new material? What do I do? So we have layer scan, which means if there's a long tone going on, I'm adding the second layer. You know, with the scan, it's just normal scanning, and when I go by, they return to the long tone. So that's one. Layer scanning is one. We have modify scanning. So if you're playing pianissimo some material, modify scan doesn't need a layer. It's not a layer. So as I come by, maybe you're playing pianissimo, and at this moment you decide to take that same material and play it quadruple forte. You know, and then there's continue scan. Yeah. There's 25 scans. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just to show you how rich they are, how rich this gesture is. Continue scan. Again, imagine if we have a whole group doing a long tone that's pianissimo, keeping the idea simple to show the gesture. Now the long tone's going on. This does not need a layer. You say continue scan, and now maybe I use continue scan and I make the volume here. So what I'm saying is with this continue scan, what I want you to do, you're in a long tone that's pianissimo at this point. Now I'm saying continue scan, and I want you, when my arm passes by, you immediately jump up to the fortissimo, the quadruple forte, as my arm passes by, and you stay on that new dynamic because it's a continue scan.
So the Mexican wave idea is still there in terms of the space of the room,
right.
But what you change or the surprise, you can be as precise as you want or be as open just with give me content.
Right, exactly.
Which I think this is illustrating the depth and quality of the language, that you can compose almost in the same way as writing it down. Your body becomes the score, or you basically give the proposition. It can be anywhere between being extremely precise and extremely open.
Yeah, I mean, that's the manner in which the sound painter, those are the two basic concepts the sound painter uses to create the composition in the moment. And one is we call for results. We know what the result, the shape is going to be. You know, it's going to be a long tone, or it's going to be pointillist. We don't know exactly what it's going to look and sound like, but we know what it's going to be. And so that's working with material that's sort of known. And then we work with the unknown or the aleatoric or, you know, the chance material.
The risk.
The risk, right, it's a risk. And a great opportunity for something new you don't expect. And so gestures like that call for, you know, a search gesture where the sound painter will search for material, or even just use the searching as part of the composition. But I'm searching for material, and then I might land on something and say, oh, I like that. I have no idea what the players are going to do. I only know the rate of development. If I haven't modified the scan, like scan with pointillism, I don't know what they're going to do. So as I scan by, I'm listening, I'm watching multi-groups, and I decide in the moment to have that continue, and then I take that material from that moment, and that's, you know, what I'm working with in my composition.
Which again comes back to the performer, as we said in the previous section, that not only do they need to remember what they've just done and what they're going to, but they need to be prepared to offer you new material that they've not actually been asked for something specific. They could offer you minimalism or pointillism when you scan, but they could offer you anything. So that they're constantly thinking, what am I going to give next, what content do I have, and to be prepared to play straight away.
Yes, and that's one of the jobs of the performer, if you will. You know, one of the goals of the performer in sound painting, as a sound painting performer, is to have the ability to offer, to be challenged, to give something new if you want to. You know, and point to point, you don't have to do something new every time you're pointed at. But you can, you know, but if the sound painter signs point to point with change, you're obligated to do something new every time. So that's a big challenge for the performer, who is pointed at multiple times to come up with new ideas. So back to what you were saying before, the performer's, you know, role is to be able to memorize things, to think in the past, present, and future all at the same time, and also to be able to offer, you know, or to be able to know when to offer, and I think, you know, those are the sort of the basic.
It's an opportunity, isn't it, to develop your performance art in the moment.
Yes, yes, it absolutely is, absolutely is. Yeah.
Right, Walter. So let's think about the multidisciplinary nature of the sound painting language. We've spoken about music and the syntax for everything, but specifically how you compose music. You've codified the language in such a way that you can assign for dancers, visual artists, etc., etc., actors. Why did you do that, and how did you do that?
Why is a good question.
Well, it's unusual for you're a composer, you're creating music, as you said at the start, you've used score material, but somewhere inside you are a visual artist, you've also been trained in dance.
Yes, I mean, I think, you know, one of the first jobs, in fact the first job I ever had, besides delivering papers as a boy, was to clean up a theater in Woodstock, New York. It was called the Woodstock Theater. And I was around a lot of actors, and I took some acting lessons. I had already been studying music at that time. I started music when I was very, very young, 5 years old, 4 years old. But I was very interested in acting, so I took some acting classes, and, you know, and I didn't go so far with it, but I was always very interested in musicals and opera, and so I've always been interested in theater and being around theater. So I think that's the reason I decided, at one point, after developing sound painting for 15 years, mainly or only working with musicians, I decided to move it into theater. When I had gotten I received a commission from Lincoln Center for the Lincoln Center Out of Doors performances to create a piece that would incorporate the public. And I asked Josh Taylor and Lise Walker, 2 actors from the Irondale Theater Ensemble, to come in and work with me. And I was the music director for the Irondale group. And I adapted the language to work with these 2 actors. And when I did that, in rehearsal with my musicians, and then the 2 actors in rehearsal, a lot of the musicians came up afterwards, many of them, and said, oh, this is really cool, this is really wonderful, this ability to sort of break down the walls between, musicians and actors, and to have this sort of hybrid of sorts that's coming from composing with text in this way and with character in this way, along with it being equal with the musicians. So I mean, the theater part came from my love for theater from a child, and then I also my grandparents were chorus dancers on Broadway, and my parents, my mother and father, were very fine ballroom dancers and square dancers. And so I've had dance in my family all these years, and I studied dance in my tap dancing and also modern dancing in my very early 20s, late teens, early 20s. And I also, so that was very easy for me to adapt sound painting to dance when the opportunity.
I sort of want to pressurise you on this in the sense that when I asked you the reason for developing music, it was a frustration that somebody was not improvising in relation to your score. I get the sense from talking to you previously, and I'd like to sort of ask you in front of the audience, why you've been so focused on codifying the language for dance, because usually when you're so focused, there's a frustration of something you want to achieve that you couldn't do otherwise. So where's the frustration in terms of codifying those signs for dance?
Well, having a background in dance, so somehow I made my love for opera something. I wanted to have all the disciplines as part of my work. And even earlier on, with having my orchestra in New York, just as with musicians, we used to do very theatrical things. So there was always some part of theater in my group. Really codifying it so it works with movement or dance has been a goal of mine, because it's one thing to sit in the chair as a performer and to look at a sound painter and read his or her signals and make the responses. It's another thing to have a discipline like dance where you need to use the space and move in the space. So how does that work? And is that going to be limiting for the dancer? And the answer is no, because of there's something called the basic movement rule that says if you see the gesture, you perform the gesture. If you don't see it, you keep doing what you're doing.
So you're setting yourself a challenge as the sound painter, that if someone doesn't see you sign, you work with that. You could sort of have a line of one person blocking somebody else and use that as a compositional tool. I mean, another query that comes to mind, and I know we spoke about this before.
And also to just add to that, is that that's what the sound painter does. He or she looks for the moment when the dancer, the person moving in the space, when they see the gesture, and he or she, the sound painter, looks for the moment when they don't see the gesture. And sometimes we'll make a decision, something simple like call the whole group to stop, knowing that one or two dancers can't see the gesture and that they're going to continue with what they're doing, because that's the basic movement rule. So it's a very interesting way to compose with movement, to choreograph live, compose, same thing. With movement, it's very interesting to look for that point when you know they can't see you, or even put them in a situation where they're going to turn away from you, and then do something because, they don't see you.
No, it's great. Now, I'm just thinking about what we said in the syntax portion of this discussion, that you defined who, what, how, and when. Where would you put literally where? Because the dancer is in the 3 dimensions.
That's how. Where is how?
So could you give us a phrase as though I'm a dancer and how I would use that?
Yeah, a very simple one. Let's just keep it really simple. In basic language for dancers, So let's say all dancers, so the dancer gesture would mean all dancers, improvise, right? And to indicate, to make you say, use the whole space, So that's how. So who, right? Dancers, what? Improvise, how, use the whole space.
So where in
when,
yeah.
So that's...
And it's all the same, you're using this imaginary box that we've got. This is that you're looking down on, but the arm becomes the stage floor in a sense.
Yeah, this is like sweeping across the entire, in the imaginary stage in front of the sound painter, like a little small table that's permanently strapped to your waist, is the stage, and you use that as an imaginary stage to indicate directions, where to carve your lines on the... where to, traverse, how to do, and da-da-da-da-da. You can sweep across to mean the entire stage,
So as much as you can say use the whole space, or come up stage, down stage, you can use space faders and what have you. some things need to be set. We've spoken about defaults, we've spoken about palettes in terms of music largely, but we have something that you've identified as universal palettes. Could you illustrate something for the audience about how you use those?
Universal palette,
Yeah.
and then this is really, really important when it comes to, you know, a lot of, I mean, if you see a number of videos on YouTube or Vimeo or Daily Motion or people's websites that are sound painters, many times you'll see the group sitting in like an orchestra formation, and then the actors or dancers will get up and go into a space in front of the group or somewhere around there and perform. That in theater, you know, we have where the curtain drops down, and then, you know, act one is over, you know, the curtain drops down, and then there's all the technical people back there changing stuff, new furniture, new lights, maybe new costumes, props, everything, and it comes back up, and then there's a new look. We're in a new area, and, you know, we're on another planet. It could be anything. And so, universal palette is, let's imagine our first look, our first stage picture, our first look is everybody seated, you know, like in an orchestral sort of setting, this, you know, chevron, this open V towards the sound painter. And that we might call universal palette 1. And then we might have in the composition, like this idea of the curtain coming down and coming back up in order to be able to show another look on stage, another formation without the curtain coming down and going back up. That's what a universal palette is a new formation on stage. We would say universal palette 2. And the performers would be responsible for moving their chairs, for bringing out maybe a table or a couch or some lamps or changing costumes. All of these things go into the next stage picture, the next look. As if the curtain came down and went back up, but in most cases, the sound painters, you know, sort of take a Bertolt Brecht way of being able to see all of it going on in front of you.
And at the same time break the fourth wall because you're doing the scene change while the audience is
Yeah, you're doing the scene change while the audience is doing what they're doing, and they're still in the piece between Universal Palette 1 and Universal Palette 2, or however many Universal Palettes you use. Sometimes I'll use 11 in an evening or more. But they're still in the piece, so you might stab freeze them as they're picking up their chair, and they get caught in a stab freeze as they're picking up the chair, or many of the other possibilities for modifying that changeover from one to the other.
So let's think of a particular example. You've got a commercially released recording Pexo that you developed in the theatre, if memory serves, and then you've recorded that used palettes. And of course our audience can watch sections of that on YouTube, so it might be worth you giving an example in relation to that work.
Yeah, Pexo that's available to, I mean, a couple of parts of it up on YouTube, and I'm going to see that the rest of it goes up. Pexo itself was really a theater piece, mostly performed in a black box theater in New York City, and also in Austin, Texas, and also up in Woodstock, New York. Pexo was my orchestra, the Walter Thompson Orchestra, which was augmented by extra dancers, extra visual artists, and extra actors. So there were maybe 25 musicians, and musicians in my group are a mixture of jazz, classical, rock, etc., etc. The dancers too, coming from differing backgrounds. There were 25 musicians, 11 dancers, and I believe 7 actors, and 2 visual artists. And in that piece, we had 11 universal palettes. And we would spend hours just practicing the changing from palette to palette. How do we get from palette 7 to 2? How do we get from 3 to 5? How do we get from 1 to 3 to 5? So we practice hours, you know, just doing this. So
we come back to the different role of the performer in this creative method, because you practice the changeover, for example, the orchestral layout where it starts sort of getting up and moving, end up with musicians in 2 columns, dancers in a column, really using the space. But you rehearse the changeover, but they have to be aware that you will adapt that changeover and stab freeze them or freeze them, what have you, in that. So they've got to be aware of, yes, you rehearse something, but that will change.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, that can happen, you know, I mean, it's always, whatever's going on in the performance, whatever's happening in front of the sound painter is usually able to work with whatever it is. But I should also point out about Pexo, just to say, it was not designed to be in the recording studio, which is where it is. It's in the studio of Tony Bennett's son in New Jersey is where we shot it. And it wasn't designed to be in a recording studio. I just wasn't able to get a really good recording in a black box theater during our performances because of the lights. You know?
And I would have thought because you're moving the entire stage set, so what you do see in PEXO is that the cables and the parts of the recording is there.
And that was the great, we spent all morning like learning, okay, how are we going to move the music stands? All the technicians were in black. You know, the camera director, Josh Taylor, was off on the side. I mean, the stage manager, you know, was doing this. Every single aspect of PEXO, how they pick up the music stands, how they move the chairs, which direction they go, all of that was pre-planned. There was nothing that's left for chance in that. And even though the way somebody picks up a cable or moves a chair, it may look very, you know, normal, so to speak. That's because that's how we rehearsed it. We spent the entire morning rehearsing it, and we shot it in one long shot, and there were no edits. Yeah, we only had one chance to edit it because a lot of my performers.
So you still followed the sound painting philosophy, even though you were recording it, in the sense it was done from start to finish without stopping.
Yeah, sorry. Well, we only had one chance to shoot it.
Yeah.
Just that one take was all we had chance. We had a chance for because a lot of my performers had to leave to go do some other work, and we were shooting during the day, and they had some evening work, so they had to leave. So we had one chance.
So it's worth looking at PEXO to see the different palettes for multidisciplinary work.
Yes.
So Walter, you've just explained for us the ways in which you're using multidisciplinary signs. Could you describe for us the ways in which you use dance that are perhaps different to the contemporary cultural context of contemporary dance and what you bring to that scene with sound painting?
Well, I think one of the things that I bring to, you know, composing with movement, choreographing live, so to speak, composing with movement, is that I bring the concepts of composing with sound to composing with movement, or to composing in theater. I like to take concepts from the different disciplines and run them across the barrier, the border of that discipline into the next discipline and see what it does to that discipline. Mm-hmm. So for me, that's one of the things I bring to composing with movement, is that I take my skills as a composer with sound and apply those same concepts to movement. And most of them are pretty much the same. So all disciplines really share so many of the same concepts, but there are some structures that are sort of more readily used or are used more often in music that are used less in dance, and those I bring across to dance. And so I think that's one of the ways that I might find my work maybe a little bit different than another choreographer, you know. One is it's live choreography, so just like anybody else, it's like choreographing ahead of time, you know, and then giving the choreography to the performers to do in performance, but the choreographer is not on stage choreographing live like you are as a sound painter. So that's another thing I bring.
Well, it's interesting you talk about the sound painting work, that it fuses all the art forms in a sense that a musician can relate to a dancer, vice versa. You can exchange material using crossover from one to the other. You sort of mentioned the idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk before the total artwork, but you're situating yourself very much within, thinking more about the music, dance, theatre educators here, perhaps in further and higher education, that you've got an equivalence of melody within dance and within theatre to such an extent your language is universal in terms of the art forms, because your long tone is still a long tone sign for a dancer, but the result is the equivalence. So again, I'm thinking of the Jacques Delcroix's list of metre equivalents that people like the dance historian Stephanie Jordan uses, or Barbara White in talking about the Mickey Mousing between music and dance, that it is possible to take the content, myself as a trumpeter can take the content from a dancer and iterate it musically.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, exactly.
Which makes me think that there are some gestures that are specific, of course, to dance or to music. So which gestures, or an example of a couple, are so specific just to dance?
Well, one would be vertical vibratory movement, or horizontal vibratory movement. Or mirror is one that, it's also could happen in music too, but this one is mainly used in dance, and if we want to do something that's similar to mirror in music, we have a different sign for that, in retrograde or whatever. We have different signs for these things. So, for example, in music, if we have, do, re, mi, fa, sol, etc. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. C, D, E, F, G, A, B. That's not going to mean anything to an actor or a dancer. An actor that sings maybe, but let's just think strictly about using words with actors. That doesn't mean anything for an actor. It doesn't mean anything for a dancer. So there's a number of gestures like that in sound painting that are specific to that discipline, but there's most of the gestures in sound painting, like the way the basic long tone, goes across all the disciplines. I mean,
so can you demonstrate a long tone for a dancer or an actor where you're seating? Can we have the dancer first?
A long tone, first of all, this imaginary staff.
You can stand up if you want.
Okay, yeah, maybe that's better. The imaginary staff in front of the sound painter. This imaginary staff, right? So, a long tone is sustained movement for a dancer. Sustained movement at a specific tempo. So if I'm signing up here, if I say dancers, long tone up here, and then give a play gesture, what the dancers are doing is sustained movement that is performed it's very rapid sustained movement. Now if I do dancers here, it's a medium tempo sustained movement, and down here would be a slower sustained movement. So for example, dancers in a medium tempo, so dancers, long tone, play, the result would be kind of this, sustained movement, so that none of so I'm not changing my tempo of what I'm doing, I'm sustaining. I'm not adding an accent, I'm not adding any accents, it's just sustained. Not repetitive, but sustained. And so if I ask for volume, for example, with dance, if I say, dancers, medium tempo sustained movement, or medium long tone, volume here, slowly enter. This keeps the movement in a smaller space. In the louder, so to speak, this is more amplitude, it's the same tempo, but it takes up more space. Yeah. I'm just using my arms, but of course you could be using your legs and everything. So up here is very fast sustained movement, and down here is very slow sustained movement, and the dancer doesn't always have to use the whole body. It could just be a hand or an arm, or you're not obligated to constantly move.